Hello and welcome to Tigers by the Fire, a podcast out of Holy Cross High School about World War II discussions and stories. With me today are Remy Sarwin.
Hi, I'm Remy.
Elias Spino.
Hi, I'm Elias.
And Cole Osborne.
Hi, I'm Cole.
Today, the guys are going to be talking about the POWs in the Philippine campaign, the Bataan Death March, and a little bit more than that. This is a topic that is not normally covered as much in textbooks, usually like a paragraph or something like that. And they're going to kind of explain why they want to cover that topic a little bit. But this is going to be episode 1 of season 5. And so I'm going to kick it off to Elias to kind of give his rationale for this topic.
I want to say the reason why we're doing this is because a lot of American textbooks, while they do talk about Pearl Harbor and the Japanese theater in general, it never really goes over the Philippines or other American subjects. Remy has mentioned, go ahead.
Like Elias said, basically, my personal account, I never knew about the Bataan Death March, and this is my first time ever reading about it, and I'm glad that I did. I discovered a lot of new information that I never saw in a textbook before. Yeah, and I kind of really got into the topic when Elias was telling me about it. It got me actually very interested in it, and then his passion for it really kind of made it an easy choice for our podcast.
Yeah, and it's one of these topics that a lot of people who are big World War II people know about, but it's not one that average students really cover in high school because of timing and everything else. And so, I mean, it's the start of the war. It's like the initial American experience, especially because it starts off with the defeat in the Philippines and the subsequent treatment of American and Filipino POWs by the Japanese after that. But let's get started, because I know you guys have a little background to kind of get into. And so we're at Pearl Harbor happens, and we're going to get the invasion of the Philippines and everything else. But let's start us off.
So to begin, obviously, again, there's Pearl Harbor. However, before the war, there was actually this group called the Philippine Scouts, right? It was a military group that allowed many Filipinos to serve and protect their country along with the United States. And they were considered pretty smart. They were considered very quick, agile, and very elite. They defended the Pacific theater very, very well against the Japanese and other oncoming Axis fleets.
Yeah, and to Elias's point, one thing I think that's really significant is the Filipinos, they're trained by the U.S. Army leading up to this, because there's a whole independence movement for the Philippines that's in the process of happening. But also, they're going to represent one of the most consistent resistance movements of the entire war, because it's really from this moment, from the invasion of the Philippines all the way to the very end, they are very active. And so I'm glad you brought them up, Elias.
In 1941, they joined with a group in the United States called the U.S. Army Forces in the Far East. For short, it's called USA FFE. For this whole entire podcast, I'm going to call it the FFE. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, America could not actually respond fast enough to the FFE, and they could not really give enough supply like medicine or troops or ammunition or food. So the Japanese had the Japanese barraged the Philippines very greatly. And then during the Battle of Bataan, which leads to Bataan Death March, it was through the course of January to April of 1942. Their initial goal is to be a buffer between the Japanese army and the Philippines, right? It's to delay the invasion. When America joins the war after Pearl Harbor, the Americans and the FFE in general had to ration their food supplies, right? General Douglas MacArthur promised that he would give food and troops to the Philippines and FFE, but honestly, it was never really fulfilled, and they were very defenseless to the Japanese.
Yeah. So MacArthur's there. He's in charge of the U.S. Army in the Philippines, and they have effectively, they're told once, after Pearl Harbor, that there's really no reinforcements coming. And that's kind of what Elias is getting at. And the Japanese initially, bomb the airfields. They bomb all the supply depots. And so from the very beginning, the U.S. Army and the Filipino fighting forces there are going to be, behind the 8 ball, if you will. They just do not have the resources needed to combat the Japanese effectively. And that ultimately, as you guys are kind of hinting at, that leads to the surrender to the Japanese on April 9th, 1942. And that will, I guess, lead us to where we're going to go. And so talk about that surrender, how many people we're talking about, and then where that leads.
Some of these soldiers actually refused to be prisoners, right? And they ran into the jungles, and some of them would become guerrillas. I want to ask some of y'all, right? If you were part of this Filipino army, the FFE, what would you think would be the better choice, to either run or to be part of Japanese subject?
So I think what you have to look at is, since we know all the information, we know like how bad it really was, but they don't. So in their mindset, I think they were probably thinking it's better to submit than run, because once you run out, they probably just be like, oh, they're going to find me and kill me. So why run? Let's just submit and do what they want. And maybe we might be saved later in the future.
Yeah. To Remy's point about like hindsight, right? Like we all know like actually how bad like the actual march was, but like in the moment, I feel like I would definitely run away, because like being a guerrilla would probably be better, and you could still continue fighting for our nation and potentially like escape. And I feel like the march, some people would consider it like kind of a death trap, like you're being captured and you don't really know where that leads. And most of the time, like during these times, it would lead to like death or like severe work, like labor. And I feel like some people would not be ready for that.
I think too, what Remy was kind of hinting at is that they just don't know, right? They're assuming this is going to be like every other war that's been fought before. And clearly World War I is not. They're assuming that they're going to be treated with like Geneva Convention rules, and that's not necessarily going to be the case. So there's a lot of assumptions, I think, on the part of them surrendering. And it's also important to keep in mind, it's not like they're surrendering like on a whim. They've been beaten down for the past 3 months. And so they're a beaten force, a force that does not have a lot of resources to keep fighting. So no, that's a good question.
So when the Philippines was subject under Japanese control, the treatment was, to no one's surprise, a lot worse than United States control. They arrested many Filipino insurgents, they arrested many children and women, and they were very exposed to harsh treatment by the Japanese. Many informants and officials would provide for the Japanese just so they could survive or for their own political gain. There are some Filipino resistances. For example, there is the Huk Rebellion, which is a communist group that tried to fight back against the Japanese very often. And obviously, again, there are the FFE guerrillas who ran into jungles. They would defend their country still. And one more discussion question before we move on to the experience of the Death March. I want to ask, do you think, even though the Japanese subject and control is worse than the Americans, do you think it's worth it to risk your life to fight against the Japanese just to be controlled by the Americans?
So what I think personally, I think being under control by anybody is not like good. Like, I think there's always going to be problems. But in this case, in like world times or World War II times, would you rather be under the Japanese who are killing your people for really no good reason, or by USA who are trying to help you, or by like they're trying to protect you from the Japanese? I think I would still fight just to know that my generation or my kids in the future would be protected by Americans rather than Japanese, where I don't know what's going to happen to my kids.
Yeah, I feel like definitely the Americans, if you treated them better, I would say like Japanese is notoriously known for more killings and that type of action. So like, as Remy's point was saying, like his future generations could be more protected and well off in America versus Japan because of the harsh treatment.
We're going to go over the experience of the Death March, which is going to be covered by Cole. And then after the Death March, I will go over the camp that they resided in. Go ahead, Cole.
Yeah. So the march, they marched through very like terrible conditions such as like rain, like extreme heat, and they were often given very little supplies, like no medicine. They are basically starved throughout the march, and the march itself was carried out around over 5 days, and they marched around 20 to 100 miles, and then but most sources would say around 65 miles. And about 60 to 80,000 Filipino and American soldiers, now POWs, were tasked to march throughout the Philippines. Many people who survived the march, since the little treatments, like little food and medicine, they would die at the work camps, such as Camp O'Donnell. Oftentimes, the lack of resources was so scarce that they would stop to drink from puddles from rain, and they would often would be shot along to continue marching, or sometimes shot just to kill them. And then the Japanese would torture them often without any reason, and beaten with rifle butt, shot, or batoned. They also had a thing called sun treatment, and that men were lined up and stood at attention in the sweltering heat from sunrise to sunset, just to kind of mess with their mental ability and to kind of break them down mentally. And then Filipino soldiers disproportionately suffered compared to U.S. POWs because Japanese just kind of thought like their religion and their beliefs were just inferior to them. So they treated them way worse than the American POWs. And then soldiers would be tied to trees, fences, and shot as an example to other soldiers / civilians in order to make sure no like riots or outbreaks would occur, just to like strike fear into them. And they would march to San Fernando, and then when they reached, they would be stuffed in boxcars, groups of 100 when the boxcars were really only designed to fit 40 people. So it was a very tight and compact space, and they didn't really care like if they died during these transports. The death from the heat and the lack of air because of all the compact cars. And then many who survived the march itself would die after getting to the camp. And the total death count was about around 5,000 to 10,000 people.
All right. So at Camp O'Donnell, which the people who resided in Camp O'Donnell, it lasted about half a year from April 1942 to January 1943. And those who survived the death march would have to withstand the torture and pain of Camp O'Donnell. Originally, Camp O'Donnell was designed to be a training area for the Filipino Army, but it was not really a modern or polished place. A lot of the barracks were built out this palm called nipa, and there was these bamboo sleeping bays, and there was floors of dirt, and some had woven mats. It was originally planned to house 30,000 prisoners, but in reality, it had to hold about 60,000 prisoners. All personal possessions were removed from the prisoners of war, and this one colonel, Richard Maloney, actually wrote an account saying that all remaining personal possessions were confiscating, including nail files, nail scissors, razors, blades, matches, pen knives, cigarettes, and pipe tobacco. All of them were confiscated, as well as blankets, shelter hats, and raincoats. Those who had items of Japanese origin actually risked execution and beheading. They had to listen from a speech of a Japanese general, Captain Tsuneyoshi, and he said that they were all cowards and should have committed suicide as any Japanese soldier would do when facing capture, because many of the Japanese would rather kill themselves over failing. The slightest violation of orders, he said, will result in execution. He already has shot many Filipinos in the past week for disobedience of orders, and he said that they are the eternal enemies of Japan. Those who passed out in the boiling sun during this speech could not really be assisted at all. The Japanese enforced many rules, and execution came if they were not followed. One rule was to salute to all Japanese soldiers. One question I want to ask y'all is, what effect would this saluting, as well as other rules, bring to these prisoners of war?
I think one of the effect is the mental aspect of it. Saluting like an enemy is like a feeling that like not a lot of us understand. Like when you have to succumb to an enemy, it's like, damn, it's lost. Like what am I still here for? But I think that's like the real reason for that rule is because they just wanted the American soldiers or the prisoners of war to just lose like their feeling of that, oh, we can be saved. They just wanted to get rid of that and make them like be workless slaves the whole time.
Yeah, I feel like the saluting would kind of like degrade their mental, like they really did lose, and like them saluting to their enemy would just kind of be like they're like now like a part of them, but they don't want to be a part of them. They feel like it's just like they can't do anything. They have a feeling of like uselessness, and just like they're just there to like be their like slaves and just work for them.
They had to suffer from many diseases because they were all very starved and exhausted from the walk and experiencing or living in Camp O'Donnell. Just like the march, they did not really have any food or medicine or shelter at all to the Filipino weather. Their rations were often a very shoddy mix of rice called lugao. Oftentimes there were worms, molds, pebbles, or just dust in it. The protein intake it was recorded that the protein intake was very insufficient. Instead of getting 70 grams for most people, they were only given 12 grams of protein. Camp O'Donnell also had no good water supplies besides this very dirty creek near it, and it was often used to drink or bathe. And as more POWs came in, water became more and more scarce. a lot of time there would be these lines towards the creek, and usually a lot of these people in those lines would die from thirst. Fecal matter was also very prevalent around the camp, and it would build on the bodies very often. And since there's no water, they couldn't really wash it off. Urination too also felt very painful due to little water to urinate, because some went 9 days without urination just because they were given so little water, so they had to urinate something. The creek was unbelievably dirty as well. Mud was infested with worms, slugs, rats, and feces. Dead Filipinos also contaminated the water more. Despite this, many desperate POWs tried to drink it.
So all of this is just going to cause disease and just more and more hardships on the camp. The lack of nutrition, but then of course the bad water supply combined with not having any protein, all of that stuff's going to factor in. And then obviously the flies swarmed the camp so much, right? And what did Sergeant Thomas have to say?
Sergeant Thomas wrote down that the camp was a Stygian nightmare. There was rotting bodies stacked everywhere. There was flies, no water, no tools, and no shelter. Flies would swarm the area everywhere. It was so damn thick. Branches bent because so many flies would rest on it. You would have to wave your hand around your food all the time, yet flies would still get in your mouth. There was hospitals in Camp O'Donnell, and all these consist of no beds or blankets. Sometimes it had dirt flooring or just crude wooden flooring. The prisoners believed that honestly staying outside was a lot more viable than just being inside, and many of them believed that the hospitals were just a place to die. The concentration of all of the sick people in those hospitals made it much, much more deadly than being ill outside. The stench was also just unbearable due to all the feces and bodies just inside. There was uncontrollable diarrhea. One of the victims wrote down saying that you just continually eliminated feces mixed with blood and mucus. It's constant and it gets over everything and everyone. Another witness has mentioned that patients, all of them are almost completely naked, were dying of dysentery, and the floor was completely covered in feces. They were too weak to stand up and walk. Another person wrote that a Japanese soldier would throw a cigarette on the ground and watch the POWs scramble to find it in the human waste. Suicide was also very common. Many just gave up and just waited for the death. Some POWs force-fed their own people to just keep them alive. Younger POWs were more prone to suicide because older soldiers had experienced more adversity during the war. Young people are obviously not developed enough in life to experience such hardships.
And older people too sometimes have lives outside of the army, and so they have maybe elongated family that they can kind of cling to, while young people don't. They have no other experiences.
Captain Olson heard the dying voice of a teenager calling for his mother. I want to ask y'all, what would be the better choice? How would suicides affect the others who try to live?
I think now that we see the camps, we see how it is, we see the conditions. Now I think committing suicide might be a more viable option, because either you kill yourself now and it's over, or you keep living through this hellhole and just have to deal with it for who knows how long. You lost all your moral. You don't even know if America's going to come save you yet. So I think suicide is definitely a viable option. I see why people did do it.
Yeah, but I also see how a suicide could hurt like the rest of the camp, because like as Elias said earlier, like the flies, like dead bodies, like just the numerous, like if you kill yourself, right, like then the flies will swarm to your body and just make all of like the rest of the camp like worse, because you have less space and it's just more infected with like disease and all this type of hard stuff. But also the suicide, I could see like as more of a selfish option, because you could take yourself out of this misery, but like what you're leaving behind could cause many more deaths just besides your own.
The total death count of Camp O'Donnell was actually not well known. We presume it's around 35,000 prisoners of war. Majority were Filipinos, but there were some Americans. There's a quite heavy deviation of 20,000 deaths because no one really knows the true death count. And that's why I want to ask y'all, why were the death counts in general just not well known?
I think we mentioned earlier how it's not really mentioned in the history books, and maybe it's because we don't have enough information to tell you. We don't know who got captured. We don't even know who like died there and like what else the Japanese were hiding. We just don't know. I think there are a lot of factors that can play into like, oh, did he die from the death march, the camp, or did he just die from natural causes? I think there's just a lot of things that can play into it, and I think that's why we don't have a say on who died.
Yeah, I feel like just like the different variety like or causes of death that could occur and they didn't keep a record of it. So they didn't actually know. And just like all these different like factors could play into someone's death. But then like, how would you tie that? Like, since they like walked in the death march, but they died like right as they got to Camp O'Donnell, is that a death for the death march, or is that a death for Camp O'Donnell? So it's like, no, there's a little like discrepancy.
And then the other factor is Filipinos who are getting put into these camps. Some of them are uniformed soldiers, so there's documentation. Some of them are just civilians that are getting rounded up that are resistance fighters or something. And so there's not as much documentation. For U.S. soldiers, we know the numbers because it's dog tagged. Everyone is documented, and we usually pinpoint most of those. But for the Filipinos, because there's a lot of unorganized groupings, especially after the Japanese takeover of the islands, that's where you don't get those numbers. So it is a very good question, though.
After Camp O'Donnell, a lot of these prisoners would go on these things called hell ships, and we'll go over them.
So hell ships. So hell ships is basically, they were, before the term hell ships, they were actually used for merchant vessels for the Japanese to use to like trade with other countries and stuff. Now, during World War II, it was used for prisoners of war, and they were crammed in there. Some compared their experience in there to the Colombian trade with the slaves in the boat. They said there was suffocation. People couldn't breathe in there. Dead bodies were also in there. So it was just like a waste of space. The hell ships, they like transported these people to either mainland Japan or to Camp O'Donnell, like Elias mentioned earlier. There are some personal accounts from, I think his name is Colonel Fraser, that there was people above him that were peeing on him, and he had to drink it because he needed some type of fluid in his body to stay alive. These ships were also unmarked. There are accounts that USA has sank some of these hell ships with like American soldiers inside of them. And that also like increases the death toll too, which is why like people sometimes don't know if it's considered like what an exact death toll is. These sunken ships often were undiscovered, and people who lost their relatives who were on these hell ships wouldn't figure out to 75 years later because they're at the bottom of the ocean. Nobody really knew. When they landed, like either in inland Japan or at Camp O'Donnell, they had to dig like this big hole to put all these dead bodies in there. And it's very uncertain if they like filled up the hole, if they burned the hole, nobody knows. Lieutenant Jacobs also explains like his own personal account of it. He couldn't breathe. He had people next to him like scratching him. He said there was infections. People were biting other people, trying to survive and get air. People were crawling on top of each other. It was just very tight and compact to the point where like you can't really do anything.
Yeah, the hell ships is a throwback to basically like the 17 and 1800s. Countries used to do that. In the American Revolution, they had something kind of similar. In the Civil War, they had some similar situations. In every case where we have POWs on these types of ships, they are really bad indications. But, eventually there's going to be liberation here, right? And eventually for the people who survive, they're going to be able to go home. So let's talk about the aftermath of this kind of event. So
1945 in February, General MacArthur liberated the Philippines from this camp. Now, today, in today's modern world, the memorial we have for them is that people will go to like certain deserts or like certain like places and just march and just walk for as long as they can, honoring those soldiers who fell in the march, those who died at Camp O'Donnell, and those like who died in mainland Japan. This is how we memorize them today.
After the entire thing, there are some personal accounts. So, for example, Colonel Glenn Frazier. He joined the army because he was very embarrassed at a dance, and he was told that he could potentially be a prisoner of war, and he would imagine the horrors of it. However, the death march was actually a lot worse than he expected. In his group of 20, many were killed by beating or shots, often for no reason. He believed that he could live forever, but yet at this march, he believed that he's going to die the next day. The barracks were placed very tight, bodies on top of bodies, and diseases sprawled all over the place.
Herb Hanneman, he was also like survivor of the Death March. He, according to like other soldiers who testified for him, he said he was a family man. He really loved his family. He was in the Philippines because he was stationed to Florida, but he was like, Florida's not quite like my type. He wanted to move. And he went to the Philippines thinking that nothing was going to happen, but as we know, something happened. He said the Japanese armies were very quick to attack. He said he was in the middle of a shower while he got surrounded by a few Japanese soldiers. He said at the end of the camp, he lost about 40% of his body mass. He went from 180 pounds to maybe 190-ish. I can't really know. He said he worked for 7 days out of the week, and he said there was only a handful of times that he remembers he didn't have to work, and he remembers those days like at the back of his memory, to show you like how bad these camps were.
Yeah, and the loss of body mass is one of the things when they liberated these camps in 1945, that the soldiers who did liberate them, they were just kind of taken back by that these people lost 40-50% of their body weight. They're kind of like walking skeletons, almost similarly to like how people felt when they liberated concentration camps in Europe. The treatment of the soldiers was just that poor. This is just kind of a snapshot of a big event. And there's a lot of different, sources to find information on this. Guys, very good job. And I'll let you guys close it out with anything you might want to add or, why this is worth talking about.
I want to personally just say it was very surprising for me to read a lot of these sources, mainly because even though many other events were very gory or tragic or grotesque, what surprised me was just how disgusting this was. There was so many, it wrote in the sources that there was so many feces, so many flies, urination, obviously gore and stuff as well. But I'm just surprised at the amount of feces and urination, just things that are usually seen today as disgusting. Y'all got any others?
Nope. No, that's basically it.
All right. Well, thank you guys. And this is Tigers by the Fire, Season 5, Episode 1. Thank you for listening.